Well, Caesar lived from about 100 BC to 44 BC, but if we want to talk about Alexander, we have to go even further back. He lived from 356 to 323 BC, and we have no contemporary accounts that survive of any kind of first-hand description of what was going on. Rather, historians depend on roughly third-hand accounts that came up 300 or 400 years after the fact. That doesn't mean we don't know anything about him, though. I mean, we know a ton about him, and all of those different sources roughly line up and give us a pretty clear picture of what his life was like.
And what he's not telling you here is that these secondary sources he's talking about were using first-hand accounts, first-hand eyewitness accounts of Alexander the Great. Take, for instance, Arrian. He is our best evidence for Alexander, and he wrote, I think it was like 500 years later or something like that. He was working off of extant first-hand eyewitness accounts of Alexander the Great. Two of his eyewitness sources were a couple of Alexander's generals. They were using first-hand eyewitness accounts to generate their information. So while their source is dated much, much later, the sources they were working off of were dated to a contemporary time frame. While we don't have these first-hand eyewitness accounts now of Alexander the Great, they were extant to these writers at the time. This type of sourcing is common in historiography. He's also not telling you that we still have extant eyewitness accounts of Alexander the Great. These would include speeches, plays, poetry, even science books. They all indicate that Alexander the Great existed. Nothing like that at all exists for Jesus. There's no contemporary evidence for Jesus, and the best evidence we have is Paul. He goes on to bring up Socrates, which is kind of historically problematic to establish whether or not he existed. I believe that his existence is highly questioned in the historical community, but the fact remains that for the majority of historical figures in history that we have evidence for, their evidence is vastly more superior than the evidence we have for Jesus. And on top of all this, Jesus was a different class of historical figure than these other people because Jesus was deified. He was supposedly this, Son of God. We should expect to have more evidence on these types of people than we would for any other historical figure. Because you see, after these people supposedly lived, these deified people supposedly lived, people started worshiping them. And so we should expect there to be a lot of evidence for them.
My point is that if you really go and look about how we know what we know about these super famous people, there isn't a ton, but it's quite a lot to have surviving for 2,000 or 2,500 years.
Oh, well, I mean, while we don't have the original, papyri or the original scrolls that these sources were written on, there is a tradition of maintaining this information over time through transcription. This is very important when we get to the evidence for Jesus. You see, the Christians were in total control of what was transcribed and maintained over time, but more importantly, they were also in control of what was lost to time.